The chapel bells had not yet finished ringing when Eleanor Ashworth heard the whisper that would break her wedding in half. "Is she gone? Tell me she's finally gone," the Duke murmured, his lips brushing perilously close to a woman's ear in the shadow beside the vestry curtain. A woman in indigo silk, who was most certainly not meant to be anywhere near the altar. Eleanor stood in her ivory gown before 300 witnesses, the priest's Bible open at the vow she had not yet spoken, and she did the one thing no bride in the history of the county had ever dared to do. She lifted her hand, silenced the priest with a single raised finger, and said in a voice that did not shake, "Before I promise my life to this man, I should like everyone in this room to hear what he just whispered to his mistress. If you have ever stood at the edge of your own happiness and felt the floor shift beneath you, you already know what came next. Comment the name of the town you're watching from, subscribe if you believe truth deserves a witness, and let's go back to where this all began, because what Eleanor Ashworth uncovered that day did not simply end a wedding. It ended an empire built on lies, and it built, from its ashes, something far more honest. 2 years before that morning, Eleanor Ashworth was not a bride at all. She was a woman with ink-stained fingers and a single black mourning dress that had been let out twice and taken in once, living in 3 rented rooms above a milliner's shop in the town of Thornfield Cross, where the smell of wet wool and lavender pressing never quite left her hair. Her father had been a country solicitor, respected but never wealthy, and when the fever took him in a single terrible fortnight, it had taken with it the modest security Eleanor had always assumed was permanent. She had been raised to read Latin and manage a household, to embroider competently and play the pianoforte adequately, to be, in short, a gentleman's daughter, and gentlemen's. Daughters, she discovered with brutal swiftness, had no trade to fall back on when the gentleman died with more debts than anyone had guessed. She sold the good furniture first, then the piano, then, with the particular quiet grief of watching a life dismantle itself piece by piece, her mother's pearl-drop earrings, the last physical proof that anyone had ever loved her enough. What remained was this: a small room, a landlady, who tolerated her only because Eleanor kept the woman's ledgers in exchange for reduced rent, and a fierce private determination that she would not become an object of pity to anyone, least of all herself. She took in copying work, legal documents, correspondence, the tedious accounts of merchants who could not be bothered to do their own sums, and she did it with a precision that, unbeknownst to her, was about to change the entire shape of her life. Because one grey October morning, a man came into the milliner's shop below her rooms, not for a hat, but because he had heard from a chemist 2 streets over that there was a woman above the shop who could read a ledger the way other people read a novel, quickly, and with an eye for what did not add up. His name, as far as Eleanor knew, that day, was Mr. Grey. He was tall, in the particular way that made low doorways a personal insult to him, dressed well but without ostentation, in a coat of good grey wool with no crest, no signet ring, nothing that announced money the way money usually announced itself in Thornfield Cross. He had a look about him that Eleanor would later come to recognize as exhaustion wearing the mask of politeness. A man who had learned to smile at people while calculating behind his eyes exactly how much they wanted from him. "I am told you have a talent with numbers, Miss Ashworth," he said. And there was something almost apologetic in the way he said it, as though he regretted needing to ask a stranger for help at all. Squint. He produced a stack of ledgers, badly organized, water-stained at the corners, and asked if she might, for a fair wage, determine whether the figures within them told a truthful story. Eleanor, who had not held a coin that did not immediately need to be spent on rent or bread in over a year, said yes before she had even opened the first book. It took her 4 days. On the 5th, she sat across a small table from Mr. Grey in the back room of the milliner's shop, her hands folded to keep them from trembling with the enormity of what she had found, and told him plainly that someone, a steward, most likely, given the pattern of the entries, had been quietly bleeding an estate dry for the better part of 6 years, moving small sums into false accounts under names that did not exist anywhere else in the ledgers, dressing theft up as expenditure on tenant repairs that had, as far as she could determine from the correspondence bundled with the books, never actually been made. Mr. Grey went very still when she said this. "You are certain," he said, and it was not really a question. "I am certain," Eleanor answered, "and I can show you precisely how. If you have another hour to spare." He had the hour. He had, it turned out, considerably more than an hour, because what Eleanor Ashworth had stumbled into, without any notion of the true weight of it, was the private financial ruin of a duke. Grey, greycoat and all, was that duke, travelling the countryside incognito because he had learned, 3 estates and 1 broken engagement ago, that no one told a duke the truth to his face, and everyone, without exception, lied to his title. Over the following weeks, what began as a transaction became something Eleanor had not expected and did not entirely trust Mr. Grey returned first with more ledgers, and then, when the ledgers ran out, simply to talk, to sit across from her in the small back room with 2 cups of tea going cold between them, while he asked her opinion on matters that seemed to have nothing to do with numbers at all. Whether she thought a tenant deserved leniency in a hard winter, whether cruelty disguised as discipline was still cruelty, whether a man who had been betrayed once was obligated to trust again, or entitled to guard himself forever. Eleanor answered him honestly because she had nothing left to protect by flattering a man she believed to be a modestly comfortable land agent, and it was precisely that honesty, blunt and unpolished and utterly without calculation. "You do not ask me for anything," he said to her once, nearly bewildered by it, as though it were the strangest thing a person had ever done in his presence. "Should I?" Eleanor asked. "Everyone does," he said, and did not explain further, and Eleanor, sensing a wound she had no right to press upon, let the silence stand. She began, against every instinct of self-preservation she had cultivated since her father's death, to look forward to his visits, to the particular way he listened to her, as though her words were the most interesting thing he had encountered in years, to the small, rare smile that transformed his tired face into something almost boyish. She told herself it was foolishness that a land agent, however kind, however curious about her opinions on justice and mercy, was not a foundation on which a ruined woman could build a future, and she told herself this so often that she nearly believed it. Right up until the afternoon he arrived, not in his grey coat, but in black, superfine, with a signet ring on his smallest finger and a footman trailing 3 steps behind him, and Eleanor understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, exactly who she had been drinking tea with for the better part of 2 months. "You are the Duke of Rothermir," she said, and it was not an accusation so much as a slow dawning horror, because if he was a duke, then everything gentle and equal between them had been, from his side, an elaborate performance, and she had been the only one who did not know the play she was in. "I am," he said, "and I did not tell you because every single person who has ever known that fact has treated me differently for knowing it. And you, Miss Ashworth, are the first person in a very long time who treated me like a man rather than a title." He explained then, standing awkwardly in her small rented room, like a man twice his size in a space built for someone else's furniture, the whole shape of the wound beneath his caution. He had been engaged once, years before, to a woman of excellent family who had, upon discovering the true fragility of the Rothermir finances beneath the ducal show of them, ended the engagement within a fortnight and told 3 separate drawing rooms. Since then, he had trusted no one with the truth of his circumstances, had gone to increasingly strange lengths, travelling as a plain Mr. Four. Grey, hiring local help under false pretenses, doing his own quiet reconnaissance into his own estates, because he had discovered that only in disguise could he learn who genuinely deserved his trust and who merely wanted his coronet. Eleanor listened to all of this with her hands pressed flat against her worn black skirt, and felt something inside her both soften with pity and harden with a fresh, clear-eyed wariness, because a man who had learned to distrust everyone was also a man who might one day, without meaning to, distrust her. But he had told her the truth now, unprompted, when he did not have to, and that counted for something. It counted, in fact, for a great deal. The estate itself, when Eleanor finally saw it, for the Duke insisted once his identity was known that she come and verify her findings in person against the true books kept at Rothermir Hall, was a vast grey stone testament to 3 centuries of accumulated wealth now hollowed quietly from within. It sat at the end of a long avenue of elms, its windows catching the low autumn light like something out of the novels Eleanor had once read to her father in the evenings, and she felt, walking up its front steps in her mended dress, every inch the intruder she technically was. She was received, not by the family, who were largely absent or indisposed, but by the steward, a thin, precise man named Mr. Alloway, with cold, pale eyes, and a way of looking at Eleanor that made her feel measured and found wanting before she had spoken a single word. It was Halloway's accounts she had examined. It was Halloway's careful, patient theft she had uncovered. And though the Duke had not yet named him aloud as a suspect, Eleanor understood within 10 minutes of meeting the man that Halloway understood exactly why she had been brought there. There was, too, another figure at Rothermir Hall whose presence complicated everything further, Lady Vivienne Cross, a distant cousin of the late Duchess, dark-haired and coolly beautiful, who had installed herself as a kind of permanent guest years earlier, and treated the house, and increasingly the Duke himself, as something she had every right to inherit. Lady Vivienne looked at Eleanor the way one looks at a stain on good linen, and said, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "How resourceful of Rothermir to find his little accountant in a milliner's shop. How very economical." Eleanor said nothing, because she had learned from a year of grief and poverty exactly how much dignity silence could protect. But she felt, for the first time since arriving, the cold edge of a battle she had not asked to fight. It was in the 3rd week of her work at Rothermir Hall, cross-referencing the estate's true ledgers against the copy she had already examined, that Eleanor found the piece that changed the shape of everything. Buried within a stack of correspondence Halloway had not thought to remove from an old filing cabinet in the estate office, a room she had been given leave to use, since the Duke trusted her judgment more by then than he trusted his own solicitor, was a letter, unsigned but unmistakably in Halloway's careful hand, addressed to a banking house in London, instructing them to transfer a substantial sum from an account bearing the Duke's seal into a private holding under a name Eleanor did not recognize. What made her hands go cold as she read it was not merely the theft, which she had already proven 6 times over in 6 different ways, but the date. The letter was dated a mere 4 days after the Duke's father, the late Duke, had died, meaning Halloway's scheme had not been a slow, opportunistic drift into corruption, but a plan laid the very moment the estate passed to an inexperienced young heir, freshly grieving and unprepared to scrutinize his own accounts. Worse still, tucked behind that letter was a second one, this in a hand Eleanor recognized with a jolt as Lady Vivienne's own elegant slanted script, addressed to Halloway and thanking him, in language just oblique enough to survive a casual reading but unmistakable to anyone looking closely, for his continued discretion regarding certain arrangements that benefited them both. Eleanor sat very still in the estate office, with the 2 letters trembling slightly in her hands, and understood that she had not stumbled upon simple theft at all. She had stumbled upon a conspiracy, patient and years deep, between the steward who managed the Duke's money and the woman who had made herself indispensable to his household, and she understood with a clarity that frightened her that the moment either of them learned what she held, her own safety at Rothermir Hall could no longer be assumed. She brought the letters to the Duke that same evening, in the small private study he used when he wished to escape the performance of being watched, and watched his face change as he read them, the tired good humour she had come to know draining into something far colder and more dangerous. "Vivian," he said quietly, and there was a whole history compressed into the single syllable of her name, a slow dawning understanding of years of small kindnesses that had, perhaps, never been kindness at all, but strategy. "She has been in this house since my father's illness. I trusted her with the ordering of the household because I believed she had nowhere else to go, and no reason to wish me ill." Eleanor watched him absorb the particular grief of realizing the people he had allowed close to him precisely because he was lonely and starved for uncomplicated affection, had been counting his silver the entire time. "We must be careful," Eleanor said, "because if they suspect what we've found before, we can act on it. They will not simply retreat. People who have built something this large do not surrender it quietly." The Duke looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded and grateful in his face, and said, "You keep saying 'we,' Miss Ashworth, as though this is your burden to help carry." "It became my burden," Eleanor said simply, "the moment I opened the first ledger. I do not walk away from a thing once I have seen the shape of its wrong." It was, though neither of them named it aloud, that night, the moment the Duke understood that he had found, in a ruined solicitor's daughter with ink-stained fingers, something he had spent years and a broken engagement failing to find among his own class, a person who wanted nothing from him but the truth, and who would fight for it even at cost to herself. The retaliation, when it came swiftly, and with a viciousness that confirmed everything the letters had suggested. Halloway, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, moved first to discredit rather than to flee, understanding correctly that flight would be read as confession, while a well-placed accusation might yet save him. He went to the Duke with a fabricated account, supported by 2 witnesses among the household staff, whom Eleanor would later learn had been quietly paid, claiming that Miss Ashworth herself had been altering the estate ledgers, planting discrepancies to extort money from a lonely and trusting Duke, being taken in by a clever fortune hunter from a milliner's shop. It was, Eleanor would reflect later, a monstrously effective lie precisely because it inverted the truth so completely, taking her own careful documentation of Halloway's theft and recasting it as evidence of her guilt rather than his. Lady Vivian, for her part, played her role with theatrical grief, appearing at dinner with red-rimmed eyes to lament how deeply it wounded her to see dear Rothermir so deceived, how she had tried. She really had tried. To warn him gently that a woman of no fortune and no family connections appearing so suddenly and so usefully in his life warranted at least some suspicion. For 3 agonizing days, Eleanor watched the household staff who had once greeted her cordially begin to avert their eyes, watched whispers travel the corridors of Rothermir Hall with the particular speed that only cruelty seems to possess, and felt the old, familiar despair of her year of poverty settle back over her shoulders like a coat she had thought she'd finally shed. The Duke did not believe Halloway's account. She could see that much in the set of his jaw when he informed her of the accusation, but she could also see, and it frightened her more than the lie itself, the flicker of an old wound reopening in him, the same wound his broken engagement had carved, whispering that perhaps he was, once again, a fool for trusting someone new. The dark hour arrived on a Thursday, grey and rain-slicked, when Halloway, emboldened by the household's growing suspicion of Eleanor, escalated from whispers to formal action. He summoned the local magistrate to Rothermir Hall himself, framing it as a concerned steward's duty to protect his employer's interests, and laid before the magistrate a set of doctored ledger pages, cleverly altered to make it appear that recent entries bore Eleanor's handwriting rather than his own. Entries showing sums, diverted not into his hidden accounts, but ostensibly into hers. Eleanor stood in the same estate office where she had found the incriminating letters and listened to a stranger in a black coat inform her, not unkindly but with the flat authority of the law, that she was suspected of financial fraud against a peer of the realm and that she would be wise to consider her situation extremely serious. She felt in that moment the full weight of what it meant to be a woman without name or fortune, accused by a man with decades of unquestioned respectability behind him. She understood that her word, unsupported, would weigh as nothing against his. The Duke, to his enormous credit, refused outright to have her removed from the house or handed over pending investigation, insisting she remain under his personal protection while the matter was examined. But even his protection could not erase the sick, hollow feeling in Eleanor's chest as she watched the very household she had tried to save turn its collective back on her. That night, alone in the small guest room she had been given, she allowed herself, for the first time since her father's death, to weep without restraint, not merely for the accusation itself, but for the exhausting unfairness of a world in which the powerful could manufacture truth. But grief in Eleanor Ashworth had a habit of curdling quickly into resolve. By morning she had dried her eyes, washed her face in cold water, and decided that if Halloway and Lady Vivienne wished to fight her with fabricated documents, she would answer them with documents that could not be fabricated, because they had already been written, sealed, and sent. She began, with the Duke's full and now unwavering support, a methodical campaign to gather what could not be argued away. She wrote first to the London banking house named in Halloway's letter, using the Duke's own seal to compel a response, and received back, within the week, confirmation of an account opened in a name that further investigation revealed to be Halloway's mother's maiden name, combined with a false Christian name. Claim of coincidence could survive it. She sought out, next, the 2 household staff members who had testified against her, and, rather than confronting them with anger, appealed instead to the plain decency she had always suspected lived beneath their fear. Both, it transpired, had been threatened with dismissal and destitution by Halloway should they refuse to corroborate his story. And both, given the promise of the Duke's protection and a private assurance that honesty would cost them nothing, recanted their statements in writing. She tracked down, through days of careful inquiry among tenant families on the estate, an elderly cottager named Mrs. Tilbury, who had years before been told her roof repairs had been paid for from the estate accounts and had never received a farthing of the promised assistance, her family having endured 2 winters of rain through a broken ceiling, while Halloway's ledgers recorded funds spent that never reached her at all. Mrs. Tilbury's testimony, delivered through tears of long-suppressed anger, became the human face of the abstract theft Eleanor had first found in numbers alone. Proof that Halloway's crime had cost more than money, it had cost the comfort and safety of people with no power to demand better. Piece by piece, letter by letter, witness by witness, Eleanor built a case so thorough, so carefully cross-referenced and corroborated, that even a magistrate, inclined toward deference to a steward's word, could not fail to see its weight. And through all of it, the Duke stood beside her, not merely as her protector, but increasingly as her partner in the work itself, riding out with her to visit tenants, sitting up late, reviewing documents by candlelight, watching her with an admiration. "I do not know how I managed this house before you arrived," he told her one evening, and Eleanor, exhausted and inked to the wrist, allowed herself finally to believe that he meant it. The public reckoning that Eleanor had been building toward arrived, fittingly, in the very room where Halloway had first tried to destroy her. The Duke convened what he termed a full accounting before the assembled household, the tenant families whose testimony had been gathered, the local magistrate whose suspicion had been so thoroughly earned by Halloway's fabrications, who had not yet grasped how completely the ground had shifted beneath her. Eleanor stood before them all, no longer the frightened accused of a week before, but a woman armed with proof, and laid out, document by document, the entire architecture of the theft, the original diverted funds beginning 4 days after the old Duke's death, the false account under Halloway's mother's name, Lady Vivian's letter of thanks for continued discretion, the recanted false testimony of the 2 frightened servants, and finally, devastatingly, Mrs. Pineville, Tilbury herself, brought forward to describe in her own plain words the winters she had spent beneath a broken roof, while money meant for its repair vanished into a stranger's pocket. Halloway's composure cracked first, his careful precision curdling into desperate bluster as he attempted to claim the letters were forgeries, an accusation that collapsed the instant the magistrate compared his own handwriting, freely given in an earlier statement, against the letters in question, and found them identical beyond dispute. Lady Vivian, seeing her co-conspirator unravelling, attempted a swift and graceless retreat into wounded innocence, insisting she had merely written a friendly note of thanks to a steward she trusted and had known nothing of any impropriety, a claim that fooled no one in the room. Whose expression, as he looked at the woman he had once considered something like family, had hardened into something final and unforgiving. "You will leave Rothermir Hall by morning," he told her, his voice carrying easily through the silent room, "and you will consider it a mercy that I do not pursue you through the courts alongside Mr. Granny." Halloway, whose fate the magistrate will now determine. The magistrate, for his part, required no further persuasion. Halloway was taken into custody before the gathering dispersed, his careful gears of theft undone in a single afternoon by the patient, methodical honesty of the very woman he had tried to destroy. In the weeks that followed the reckoning, Rothermir Hall settled into a kind of exhausted, grateful peace. The household staff, who had once whispered against Eleanor, now regarding her with something closer to reverence. The tenant families whose grievances had finally been heard sending, in the particular way of people with little to give but gratitude, small gifts of preserves and mended linens to the estate office, where she still, out of habit and genuine usefulness, spent her mornings. The Duke restored to every wronged tenant the full sum of what had been stolen from them with interest, and made a point of visiting each family personally, an act that Eleanor watched with quiet pride, understanding it as evidence of exactly the kind of man he had chosen at last to be, rather than merely to inherit. It was on one of these visits, riding back from the Tilbury cottage in the soft gold light of a late afternoon, that the Duke finally said aloud what had been building, unspoken between them for months. "I have been engaged once before, Miss Ashworth, and I told myself after that experience that I would never again risk my heart on anyone who had not first proven, beyond any doubt, that they wanted the man rather than the title. You have now proven that more thoroughly than I had any right to ask of anyone, because you defended me and this house long before you had any reason to believe it would ever benefit you. And you did it while the entire world seemed determined to believe the worst of you. He dismounted, helped her down, though she needed no help, and stood holding both her hands in the fading light. "I love you," he said, with none of the guarded caution she had first known in him. Not the version of me who hid behind a grey coat and a false name, but the actual man beneath it, flawed and frightened, and until you arrived, entirely alone in a house full of people. Will you marry me, Eleanor, and let me spend the rest of my life proving I deserve what you have already given me freely? Eleanor, who had arrived at Rothermir Hall with nothing but a talent for numbers and a refusal to be pitied, wept for the second time in that story, though this time from a joy so total it left no room for anything else, and said yes before he had even finished lowering himself to one knee. Which brings the story at last full circle to the church where it began, to the moment the vows had nearly been spoken and were instead interrupted by Eleanor's own steady voice, demanding that the room hear what the Duke had whispered. For the wedding the world watched that day was not, as it happened, Eleanor's wedding to Rothermir at all, though every soul in Thornfield Cross had assumed exactly that for the better part of a year. It was, in a final, cruel design, a wedding Lady Vivienne had engineered from the shadows of her supposed exile. Having spent the months since her banishment, quietly insinuating herself back into the periphery of society, under reassumed connection, and having convinced a desperate socially ambitious young woman named Miss Prentice, newly arrived in the county, that the Duke's affections could be won, and Eleanor supplanted through a scheme involving forged correspondence suggesting Eleanor had abandoned the engagement for a wealthier suitor abroad. Miss Prentice, manipulated and not entirely without her own share of blame, had allowed herself to be presented to the Duke as his intended under circumstances so carefully staged. A forged letter here, a fabricated witness there, never suspecting that the entire courtship had been orchestrated by the very woman he had exiled. It was Eleanor herself, arriving in secret with the true unforged letters she had never sent, and the sworn testimony of the coachman Vivian had bribed to intercept and destroy her actual correspondence to the Duke during a brief and entirely explicable absence to settle her late father's remaining debts. Who reached the church only minutes before the vows, and it was Vivienne's own whispered words to Miss Prentice at the vestry curtain, "Is she gone? Tell me she's finally gone," was, in fact, Vivienne coaching her protégée through her nerves, congratulating herself on the success of her long game that Eleanor overheard and understood in an instant for what they truly were, standing at the back of the church in her travelling clothes rather than a bridal gown, for she was not the bride that day, but the truth, arriving just in time to stop a lie from being sealed before God and witness. Eleanor did not merely halt the vows, laid the true letters and the coachman's signed confession before the astonished priest, and watched the Duke's face move through disbelief, fury, and finally a relief so total it broke visibly across his features as he understood he had very nearly married a stranger to satisfy the final vicious revenge of a woman he had already once cast out. Lady Vivian was removed from the church that same hour under formal charge, her second and final scheme collapsing as completely as her first, while Miss Prentice, humiliated but ultimately more foolish than wicked, was permitted to return quietly to her family with her reputation intact. And it was 3 months later, in that same church, with no forged letters and no hidden schemers left to interrupt them, that Eleanor Ashworth actually became Duchess of Rothermir, standing this time not at the back of the aisle but at its front, in a gown of her own choosing, speaking vows she meant with her whole unguarded heart to a man who had learned, at devastating cost, that the only love worth having was the kind that had already proven itself before it ever knew what it stood to gain. They built, in the years that followed, an estate known throughout the county, not for its wealth alone, but for its fairness, its tenants housed and paid honestly, its ledgers open to any who wished to see them. A living monument to the plain truth, Eleanor Ashworth had believed, since she was a girl with ink-stained fingers and nothing left to lose, that quiet integrity, however long it is mocked or doubted or nearly destroyed, will in the end stand taller than any title built on lies.